Did you know that global debt will never be paid off? This is not a theory. The system was built this way. In this video, we will reveal the 4 possible paths that countries can take to alleviate this, and how each of them directly affects you and your family. And most importantly, you will understand how to position yourself now, before it impacts your bank statement. Let us begin then. Today, the debt in the United States alone surpasses 33 trillion euro. American families collectively owe an additional 17 trillion euro. Private companies add a few more trillion euro. And this does not even include the global dollar debt circulating outside the United States, estimated at over 65 trillion euro. Now, compare this figure with the total amount of dollars in existence, just under 21 trillion euro. In other words, there is far more debt than currency available to pay it. How is this possible? The answer lies in how money is created. Contrary to what many believe, it does not come ready-made, printed in bulk by central banks. It emerges when someone takes out a loan. Imagine you deposit 1,000 euro in the bank. Seems simple, right? But now think. What if that same 1,000 euro is used as the basis to create several other loans simultaneously? In just a few steps, the same 1,000 euro is already supporting multiple debts at the same time. The money has been multiplied without ever actually being created. This mechanism is known as the fractional reserve system. It works because everyone believes that the resources will be available when needed. But there is a critical detail. The sum of all debts will always be greater than the monetary base. This means that even if everyone wanted to pay their debts at the same time, there simply would not be enough money in the system to do so. And now comes the more concerning part. This logic is not a flaw. It is the foundation of the modern financial system. All money is created as debt. Therefore, it is arithmetically impossible for all debts to be settled. But if the system depends on eternal debt, what happens when interest rates suddenly spike? This is where the castle begins to tremble, and you will understand exactly why in the next few moments. From the 1980s to 2020, each economic cycle has been accompanied by ever-decreasing interest rates. This encouraged governments to issue more debt, companies to leverage themselves, and families to finance everything. In an environment where the cost of money fell year after year, indebtedness seemed not only viable, but advantageous. But this cycle has come to an end. With global inflation reigniting after decades of dormancy, central banks reversed course. In just a few months, interest rates rose from nearly zero to levels not seen in decades. And here is the critical point. The global economy was not built to withstand high interest rates. Governments now spend more on interest than on infrastructure. Previously healthy companies see their profits evaporate in the face of rising credit costs. Families feel the impact on home financing, car loans, or even credit cards. The burden of debt hasn't changed, but the cost to maintain it has skyrocketed. And when this happens, the gears of the system begin to falter. It is not the size of the debt that breaks the system, but the speed at which interest rates rise. But then, if paying off debts becomes unsustainable, what will governments actually do? The answer lies in 4 pathways. And now I will show each of them. One of the oldest responses to an overloaded debt system is forgiveness. The idea is simple. In times of financial overload, debts are partially or totally erased, either by political decree, institutional collapse, or informal agreement. Does it seem radical? Perhaps, but it is already happening. In 2023, the United States simply erased over 100 billion euro in student debt, and no one was consulted. This was just the beginning. How long until this arrives here as well? Today we see more sophisticated versions of this mechanism. An example is the relationship between the American Treasury and the Federal Reserve. When the Fed buys government bonds, it is, in practice, financing the government with newly created money. These bonds go onto the balance sheet of the central bank itself. And here is the detail. Any interest paid on this debt returns to the government itself. In net terms, this debt practically disappears. It exists only in accounting, not as a real obligation. The impact of this is profound. It is not just about erasing debt, but about silently redistributing the losses. Investors who sold their bonds early absorbed losses. Ordinary citizens, through inflation, pay the bill indirectly. And meanwhile, the government eases its fiscal pressure without directly confronting the electorate. But there are always consequences, especially for those on the wrong side of the equation. In this case, that is us, the citizens. And even more importantly, this type of measure is selective. It works for certain debts at specific moments, but does not solve the structural problem. If debt forgiveness is not sufficient or politically viable, the system may follow a much more painful path: deflationary deleveraging. In this scenario, debtors begin to default in a chain reaction. Companies are unable to renew their financing. Families stop paying mortgages, and governments abruptly cut spending. Money ceases to circulate, and when this happens, the economy does not slow down. It freezes. A striking example was the Great Depression in the 1930s. Thousands of banks failed, credit dried up, prices plummeted, but not because things became cheaper, rather because no one could afford them anymore. Jobs disappeared, wages shrank, and panic became public policy. It was a shock that lasted nearly a decade, leaving scars that shaped the century. This collapse occurs because the money in the system is scarce and highly leveraged. As we saw earlier, most of the money exists in the form of credit. When loans are cancelled, whether due to default or bankruptcy, the money literally evaporates. And the more people try to protect themselves, the more they feed the spiral. They pay off debts, consume less, money circulates even less, and the decline accelerates. The modern banking system is particularly vulnerable to this domino effect. Banks operate with extreme leverage. Small losses quickly become insolvency. Therefore, the phrase that should be engraved in every investment portfolio is clear. Liquidity dries up before collapse. Those with cash survive. Maintaining at least 6 months of expenses in liquid and secure assets, such as short-term securities or deposits in solid institutions, is a minimum defense. But what if, instead of accepting deflation, governments decide to flood the system with money? The result is a very different and potentially more treacherous path. To avoid the chain collapse of deflation, many governments opt for another path: inflationary deleveraging. Instead of allowing bankruptcies and credit destruction, central banks step in and inject liquidity. They create new money to cover holes, bail out institutions, or finance deficits. On the surface, this seems like an effective solution. However, the cost comes in another currency: purchasing power. This is precisely what happened in the case of Silicon Valley Bank in 2023. When the bank collapsed, the American government guaranteed all deposits, even those exceeding the official protection limit. How? By creating additional money. No taxes were charged directly, but the cost was transferred to the rest of the economy via future inflation. This maneuver has become the silent, standard response in crises: print now, pay later, in real value. In this process, fixed assets such as money in current accounts, fixed income securities, and poorly indexed pensions lose value over time. In contrast, real assets such as stocks of productive companies, real estate, and commodities tend to preserve or even increase their nominal value. The most important point is that inflation acts as an invisible tax on savers. It is a transfer of value from savers to the issuers of currency. Worse still, it is selective and unpredictable. An inflation rate of 8% per year halves the real value of your money in just 9 years. Without warning, without negotiation, without exemption. This path is the most likely when politics dominates the economy. But what if, instead of inflating or collapsing, there was another way out? There is a fourth path, the most desired by optimists and the most difficult to achieve: a productivity boom. In this scenario, the economy grows so much in efficiency and innovation that the gains outweigh the burden of debt. It is like a debt-laden entrepreneur who, by significantly increasing his revenue, manages to pay everything off comfortably. On a national scale, this requires something akin to what we witnessed during the Industrial Revolution, or, more recently, with the digitalization of the economy. Artificial intelligence and biotechnology promise advances that could transform entire sectors. But even if that happens, there is a crucial detail. Productivity does not emerge overnight. It requires institutional stability, solid infrastructure, quality education, and clear rules, factors that are not always present, especially in economies with high levels of debt. Yes, growth can help mitigate part of the problem, but it does not provide a short-term solution. And until then, the debt continues to mount and interest rates keep rising. Therefore, waiting for a productive miracle is risky. It is better to prepare for the realistic scenario and to protect your assets now. But how exactly can one do this in a rational and efficient manner? The first measure is to focus on real assets with intrinsic value, shares in resilient companies, productive real estate, precious metals such as gold and silver, and even a tactical allocation in Bitcoin. All have something in common. They do not depend on trust in governments or currency issuance. They represent concrete and scarce value. At the same time, it is prudent to avoid concentration in long-term fixed income securities, especially with fixed interest rates. These bonds may seem safe in the short term, but in inflationary environments, they quietly erode value. On the other side of the equation, it is worth considering the passive side. If you have long-term debts with low interest rates, they can work in your favor, as the interest charged will be lower than the devaluation of the currency. Another smart approach is to maintain strategic liquidity. This is where the barbell strategy comes into play, a combination of safety and boldness. On one side, cash and liquid assets to withstand shocks. On the other, selected assets with high growth potential. However, protecting is just the first step, because what worked in the last few decades will not work in the coming ones. The last 40 years have been a historical exception. Continuous declines in interest rates, controlled inflation, and stable growth created an environment in which almost any strategy worked. But that cycle has ended. The next 40 years will be different, possibly more volatile, less predictable, and much more selective about who will be rewarded. Normal will not return. Expecting markets to behave as they did before is like navigating with old maps in seas that have changed shape. The game has changed, and future gains will not come to those who seek absolute security, but to those who build a strategy robust enough to withstand storms. This means reviewing your portfolio with a new perspective, like someone designing a boat to sail through turbulent waters rather than across a calm and predictable lake. The practical execution of this shift in mindset is what separates those who survive from those who thrive. Are you ready for this? If you want to preserve and expand your wealth in this new cycle, subscribe to the channel and like the video. This is the type of knowledge that positions you ahead of the market. Ignoring this scenario is the greatest risk you can take. We will see you in the next video.